Welcome to everyone to our third webinar on racism with Drick Boyd. My name's Chris Eisenbeiss. I'm chair of the Outreach and Service Committee that's putting this webinar on. We've been blessed to our last two Tuesdays with some good information, good discussion, and I'm looking forward to our session tonight. Before we start, let's have a prayer and ask God's blessing. Dear Lord, we thank you for the blessings of this day. We thank you for the opportunity to gather this evening to learn and think about racism and the ways it affects our lives. We thank you for our presenter, Drick Boyd, and the way he has shared of his expertise and his life experiences. We ask you bless his sharing with us today, and we ask your blessing on us all, that we might be more effective witnesses to your love and grace. In Jesus' name we ask, amen. So I am going to introduce our presenter, Drick Boyd, again. And so those of you who may not have been here the first two times can know who he is and where he comes from. Drick Boyd is Professor Emeritus of Eastern University, where he taught courses in urban theology, leadership, social justice, and race and ethnic relations in the Department of Social Transformation. He's been active in social justice organizations, addressing issues such as gun violence prevention, fair funding of public schools, and gentrification. He's the author of 3 books. He is the father of 3 adult children. He lives in Broomall, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia, with his wife, Cynthia. And he is a member of West Philadelphia Mennonite Fellowship. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Drick.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I got to hand it to you, sticking with us for 3 sessions on a very difficult topic. I'm very pleased. And I'm looking forward to tonight. The last couple of nights we've been dealing with things in sort of the broad spectrum, but I hope tonight we can get down to some real practical things that we can do. I've called this session Disrupting Whiteness. It's how do we deal with the culture in which we are living in? How do we talk with our white friends, our white neighbors, our coworkers, our family members, about these very important issues of race and about as it relates to individuals, as it relates to other citizens, and as it relates to us as Christians. So I'm gonna share my screen with you again. And give me a second here. And I should say that the title, Disrupting Whiteness, is actually the title of a book that I've been working on and hopefully will be coming out later this year. And it really deals with how do we talk with our white friends and neighbors and family members about this issue of race, because it is a tough thing for many of us who are white to talk with others about. It's just a very difficult topic and can make people uncomfortable. And so I'm hoping tonight I can at least address some of that and maybe give us some tools for thinking about it and talking with others. So just a little bit about where we've been over the last 2 weeks. In the first session, we talked about what racism is and its multi-dimensional nature and how it has shaped our lives and our identities. How we think about ourselves and how we think about others through this lens of race. We talked about messages that we received when we were growing up and how that began to shape our worldview and how we began to get in touch and contact with people of other races. Sometimes this socialization we go through is very overt, but often it's very subtle. And it's only upon reflection do we realize that we've been led to think and feel in certain ways about people of other races. This racism that we've been talking about it affects us on our individual lives, but we've also talked about how policies and practices that govern institutions have often had a racial bias in them, and that the systems that operate on our society are often tilted in a way that deny access or limit access to people of color in things such as access to healthcare, the quality of public education, the accumulation of wealth, the sentences that are handed down in the criminal justice system, and even the ability to vote in an election. And as I've said, this pervasive influence of racism has, at all levels of our society, has deeply influenced our culture. And I called that cultural influence a culture of whiteness or of white supremacy. So tonight, what I want to do is I want to explore with you the way we can respond to this pervasive influence of whiteness and racism, how we can disrupt and even turn back the influence that this racism has on our lives, in our families, in our friendships, in our workplaces, and in our churches. And this is a huge and complex topic, which I won't be able to fully address tonight. So I want to focus on three areas. I want to focus, first of all, of identifying the impact that racism has had on our own lives, and then how we can respond to the racist actions and words of people in our lives. And then finally, a few words at the end about the role of the church in combating racism, since we are here as members of churches and we're concerned about this as an issue in our churches. So I want to start with ourselves. And last week, and look at the impact that racism has had on our own lives. And how do we do that? And last week, I posed 4 questions as a way of sort of beginning to get us to think about how we first were introduced to this idea of race. You know, I asked at what age did we become aware of race as a thing in our lives? And when do we first remember encountering a person of another race? And what was that like? Who was that person? What were our thoughts and feelings around that? And then the third question was, what sort of messages did we receive from significant others about people of other races, and particularly that race that we may have first encountered? And when did we first experience or witness racial discrimination? And what were our thoughts and our feelings? And some of you shared some thoughts. And these questions are very personal, and they're designed to get us thinking about our early years and when our minds and our attitudes were first shaped by race. And some of you shared some interesting experiences, and I was wondering if anyone else had any more thoughts that they wanted to share about that early influence that they had in their life about thinking about issues of race. Anybody had any additional thoughts on that issue? So I'll move ahead then. Those questions begin to get us to think about critical incidents in our lives that may have shaped our attitudes and our experience and our perception of people of other races. And I think one of the first questions we would want to ask is, when we think about race, who are those racial others? And are those people of other races that come to mind and we encounter in life? And you know, it's very different in different parts of the country. For instance, here in the Philadelphia area, Philadelphia is a majority minority city. So the largest racial group in Philadelphia are African Americans, followed by whites, but then there's also a significant Hispanic population. We are a destination for a lot of immigrant groups. So there's a wide variety of different Asian groups, from Indonesia, from China, from the Middle East. And so when I think of racial others, I have in mind some of those groups. But I know, for instance, in South Dakota and maybe in Minnesota and maybe even Nebraska, there are a number of Native American groups that call that home. You also may have refugee groups in your city, as someone wrote, Chris, over the week, after last week, indicating that there were some folks refugees from the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire, in their church or in their community. And you may have different immigrant and refugee groups in your area that you think about when you think about this issue of race. It may not always be African Americans or Hispanics. It may be other groups. And when you think about your interactions or things that you've heard, things that you've seen, what are some specific events or interactions you may have had with people where race was a major factor? And maybe these incidents opened your eyes to something that you hadn't seen before, or maybe you had an encounter that may have been somewhat uncomfortable, but it's something you haven't forgotten. Or maybe you encountered something and it troubled you to witness this, but you didn't quite know what to do. You didn't quite know what to say, but it stuck with you. It's important for us to think about these critical incidents in our lives and how they may have impacted us to come to the place where we are today when we think about issues of race, and why we would even spend 3 Tuesday nights at a webinar looking at this issue. For each of us, it may be different things. Last week, someone shared the experience of being in Africa, and when they would be standing in line, people said, "Oh no, you go first. You're a white man. You go first," and how he felt uncomfortable. Well, that's a significant critical incident that obviously left some questions. And someone else shared the story of being at a basketball game and calling out someone who was using the N-word, yelling that at someone who was playing the game, and even being called an N-word lover as a result of that. And that also is, I would think, a very impactful experience. I can think of, I've had lots of incidents, but some incidents that stick to mind, come to mind. When I was in college, my second semester in college, I was down south. I was in Durham, North Carolina at Duke University, a very traditional Southern school at that time. And I was in a course on poetry. And we had to do a report on a poet and share some of that person's poetry and then give a little background on who that person was. And I did my paper on the African-American poet Langston Hughes, who was known as the Bard of Harlem. He was well known internationally. And so I wrote this paper. I was really excited about it. I had to do a presentation and students really liked it. And yet I got a C on the paper. When I asked the teacher why I got a C, she said, "Oh, Langston Hughes is not a poet of note." And it really struck me. Here was a world famous poet, someone who traveled the world, and yet to this professor who was from the South, he was not someone to even be considered. I can think of another time when I was in a workshop actually talking about working together across race on social issues. And I was called out by an African-American woman who felt that I was condescending in what I was saying to her. And my first reaction was one of being really hurt and upset. But as I talked with people and as I reflected on it, I realized that I had conveyed to her that she was somehow less important, less valued than I was, just by the way I talked. I think of another time, this is also when I was getting ready to graduate from college, and I had told my father that I was leaving college and I was going to work with street kids in a neighborhood in Boston Massachusetts, known as Jamaica Plain. It was a low-income neighborhood that had about a third African Americans, a third Puerto Ricans, and a third poor white folks. And my father's reaction was, "You're wasting your education." Here I sent you to school and now you're wasting your education. And that really stuck with me too, that my father would think that this concern to work for the poor and go to a city where there was all sorts of racial strife was somehow wasting my education. And these were the kinds of incidents that I ran into as I was growing that really made me think about what was going on with my father, what was going on with this other woman in this workshop, what was going on with my teacher. What was this thing called race, and why was it so powerful, and why did it influence people's attitudes and value systems so profoundly? And as you think about these critical incidents, it helps you, and you reflect upon them and what they meant to you at the time and what they may mean to you now. It helps you begin to get a sense in the way in which you have been shaped to understand race the way you do. And I was wondering if any of you might have any such incidents in your life that you'd be willing to share, where you learned something about yourself or about racism or about people of other races, that kind of where the lights kind of went on for you. Anybody have anything that comes to mind in that regard? Okay, I don't see any takers today, so we'll continue on.
We have one.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
This is Dennis from Salem Mennonite. I have a very humbling experience to share. When I was in language study in Belgium in preparation to go to Zaire, Africa, with Africa Inter-Mennonite Mission, I was asked to go to the airport to meet an incoming missionary that was coming for language study, a missionary family. And so I went to the airport and did have a sign with the name of the family. Went to the terminal and waited, constantly searching for this new missionary family. After a couple of hours, we left the terminal and walked through the airport, other areas, looking constantly to find where this family might be. And finally, we went home, never having found them. The next day, I met them, and to my horror, I met an African-American family. They were the missionaries that I was to have received at the airport, and it never crossed my blind eyes to think that a Black African-American missionary would be joining us and going to minister to the African Blacks. That was the most humbling and shameful experience I can remember.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind, what do you feel like you learned from that experience?
That missionary work is not limited to white race.
Mm. I appreciate you sharing that. I know that probably wasn't easy, but I appreciate that's a great example of how, you know, our filters that we have grown up with, and as you said, you never occurred to you, and so you didn't see them in the light, in the way that they were. Yeah, that I've had a lot of those same kind of experiences, and I appreciate you sharing that. Does anyone else have anything that comes to mind you wouldn't mind sharing? Well, we'll have time later here. So if something comes to mind, please be willing to share. This is helpful. So these incidents, these critical incidents, they shape us, and they either make us more resistant to learning or more open and more humble. And gentlemen, you shared, obviously you are more humble and more open as a result of this. And it was a positive thing. But so often people have experiences that really push them away. And part of our own growth as Christians, as individuals, as people concerned about racism, is to try and be open, even though those things can be very uncomfortable to admit to ourselves and maybe to others if necessary. We want to learn from these experiences and be more open. As I said, I think more than once, one of the challenges that we who are white have in this society is that we were not really trained, socialized in our upbringing through our education, but how to talk about race, how to think about race, how to bridge the differences of race. It's just something that was kind of left to someone else to teach us, and no one did. And even though I think as a culture we've come a long way over the last 50 years, we still often find ourselves grasping at straws. And so it's being able to be open to the learning from these critical incidents that really can shape us. I often have kidded my students over the years. I said, the reason I'm so smart is I make so many mistakes and I learn from them. It's not the end of the world to make a mistake, but if we learn from them, we can really grow. And I think this is especially true when we think about our experiences with people of other races and our perceptions of events that deal with people of other races. And one of the things I think that's always important to keep in mind when we think about these experiences, the difference between intent and impact. Often we intend to do or say something that's positive or helpful. Our motivations are pure, but it's taken in a different way than we might have intended it to be. So our intentions are honorable, but the impact can be hurtful to someone else. And I go back to the example I gave of the woman who called me out at the workshop for being condescending. She was a woman probably about the same age as me. She was a bus driver in Philadelphia. And we were in this interracial workshop talking about how we can work for social change across differences of class and race. She was a single mother, lived kind of a working class life. And here I was, this college professor coming in and talking about all this stuff. And it was clear as I listened to her and listened to others as they helped me deprogram this, that the way I was coming off was like I was a no-no. And my reaction at first was one of deep hurt and saying, well, I'm not going back there. It's not worth it. I don't want to, I'm embarrassed. And, I talked with people who were there and they helped me kind of see what I was doing and how I'd come off. And, I eventually did go back and continued with the group, and the woman and I, we never really reconciled, but we worked, we were able to work together. And I saw that in the long run as a very helpful lesson for me about the difference between what I thought I was saying and what I thought I was doing and how it was coming off. And I think often when we're dealing with people of other cultures and other races, we all bring a certain amount of baggage and hurt that includes hurt and misunderstanding. And so sometimes these critical incidents we have help us understand that how we come off and how we carry ourselves may impact and influence people in different ways. And so that's always been a helpful insight for me. I think often one of the best examples I can think of where this often comes into play is, these church short-term mission trips where we're going to build houses, or we're going to dig wells, or we're going to do something to to help the people. And we're never quite sure how people look at us. I remember one time I took a short-term mission trip with a youth group out to a Native American reservation in South Dakota. I was in Minneapolis. We drove out somewhere in South Dakota, and we were working on building a playground. And what struck me as odd is that we really had almost no interaction with the residents who were at that reservation, and they kind of looked at us and stayed at a distance. And I often wondered if, while our intention there was very positive, if the people there felt invaded, if they felt demeaned, if they felt like we were somehow taking over, and we didn't really connect with the people, and so we may have left a different impact than we intended to. And so as we think about these critical incidents, it's always important to be aware of that distinction between what we intended to do and how it may have actually been received by others. And as we reflect on all of these things that I've talked about, our early influences, our critical incidents, the ways in which maybe things we said or did were taken differently than we intended, we can develop what I call our race story. And someone shared last time that one of the things we can do with other people is share our own story. And I think that's really important, and why it's so important for us to sort of take stock of ourselves, that how we have been shaped by racism and how it has led to us to some humbling and maybe difficult experiences, and how we have tried to change as we've learned over these years, and how we try to take stock of ourselves. And not to share that story in some sort of, oh, I've got it all figured out sort of way, but rather inviting people to recognize that this is hard, but it is important, and that we have taken time in our own lives to learn, to grow, to try and understand the way in which we have been shaped and how we've tried to change things that maybe we had been taught or led to believe earlier in life. And as we share that race story with people, it makes it very personal. And so I guess the first thing that I would say in terms of how we take stock of ourselves and what can we do for ourselves is to really take time to reflect on those experiences in our lives that have shaped us, and in a sense, begin to construct a story about how we have grown and changed and learned over the years with regard to race.
Drick, we had somebody that wanted to share.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been hearing what you've been saying, and I just wanted to share a few things. First of all, one that I'm an older person now from East Union here, but when I was young, so to speak, I came back from service and I thought I knew something. Anyway, I needed a job. My father was a farmer, but he didn't have enough work right then, so I applied. And I got a job at the VA hospital as a nurse's aide. And at first it was kind of difficult about the job itself, but anyway, I was happy with the job. And there was a friend, I call it a real friend, who also was a nurse's aide, and we were in the same class to be introduced to what our job was. And anyway, I had a good time with her, and we laughed about a lot of different things. And anyway, one night we both got off work, I guess, at the same time, and I can still remember this, that I was down there ready to leave, where we kind of met, or people met to go home. And she asked me for a ride home. And my goodness, as I think about it, I still remember this and I hate it, but I made some excuse not to take her home. And ever after that, she avoided me, and I didn't know how to handle it. And I guess I just didn't act and try to talk to her again. The other time when I was older, I went to Ohio State for the School of Social Work. And we had a really nice class where we had to learn how to do social work. We call it out in the field. I had a good supervisor who was a black lady. And I really admire her, and we got along great. But anyway, on campus then, at that time, it was in the early 60s, you didn't see black and white couples very much, maybe one here or there. Then as I was walking from campus to my home, I was walking with this wonderful black lady who was in my class, and we had always had a good time. And I kind of got the faint notion that, well, maybe I should just say, I'm going this way and not walk with her the rest of the way. And I said to myself, Kenneth, if you want to be a social worker, that is a terrible thing. That's a terrible thought. And if you can't do this, you're not deserving to be in the School of Social Work. So I walked with her, and I felt better about myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that. And I can tell just by the way you tell them how powerful those experiences have been. And yeah, and being able to share those stories with others, I think is really powerful. Thank you. Did anybody else want to share anything? So yeah, that is understanding the impact that racism has had on our lives, and in very particular ways, like were just shared, I think are really powerful. It's made us who we are. We aren't, we are the products of our history. Another thing that I think many of us need to do, and I know some of you have shared some things that lead me to believe that you've already done some of this, but we need to become a little bit more educated. And so I just want to share some things. I mean, first of all, in our American history, that's the narrative that is told, slavery and racism is kind of a little chapter, but we're led to believe, well, that happened back in the 1860s and we're good now. But racism has really been at the core of our history from the very beginning. You may have heard of the 1619 Project that came out of the New York Times, and it's just a series of essays and other people are adding to it, things about the way racism has run through our history from the very beginnings at Jamestown. And so becoming more educated about our history is really good. And these are just a few books that I have found particularly helpful. Ibram Kendi's Stamp from Beginning is really the history of racism and racist ideas in America. It's an excellent book, just came out a couple years ago. A book that provides a window into the great racial and ethnic diversity that is our nation, and the history of all these different ethnic and racial groups is Ronald Takaki's A Different Mirror. Talks about the Chinese, the Japanese, the Irish, Jews, Native Americans, and really kind of helps us see the wide spectrum of peoples that make up our nation. I've often said to people that we do have many problems around race and ethnicity and getting along with one another. The United States is the most culturally and racially diverse country on the globe. And that's part of who we are. And it's part of our heritage. And Ronald Takaki really does a great job of highlighting that. For those of you who are interested in sort of the Native American story, this book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, is a really wonderful, wonderful book. And I think more recently, we've come in our culture to recognize that there's a whole history of the people who were here before the first Europeans landed here that is a really important history. And she does a great job of helping us understand the impact of, of the European arrival, and then with slavery, the arrival of the Africans on the indigenous peoples of this nation. And it's one of the things that I think is really important is trying to understand how this larger narrative of our history of our nation impacts our own personal history. And so the book I've put up there, Slaves in My Family, is an example of a book that tries to bring together those two streams of history. It's actually a book written by a man named Edward Ball, whose family and ancestors were plantation owners in the Charleston, South Carolina area. And every year, the descendants of this family, these plantation owners, would meet in Charleston and have a family reunion. And Edward Ball got curious about the slaves who worked on those plantations. And so he did a lot of research and was able to track down descendants of many of those who had worked on his family. And it was a real eye-opener to me that, you know, there's this big interest in family history with Ancestry.com and all that sort of stuff, which kind of tells us, you know, who came after who. But another piece of that is really understanding how our personal family history fits into the history of racism and how our people were impacted and impacted those racial others who were in our midst. So becoming more educated about our history is, I think, really, really important. And there are lots of good resources out here, and these are just a few of them. Another thing is becoming more educated about how the impact of racism on our lives. And again, there are lots of resources. I've just shared a few that have been important for me. Author by the name of Tim Wise has written a number of books on this topic. His own personal story is this story, White Like Me, where he sort of tells his own race story and how he grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and the interactions he had with African Americans there, and then going to college and then afterwards. So a really important study. And then the book I mentioned and talked a lot about last time, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, I think is a really excellent book. A really good book from the perspective of the Christians is this book by Jennifer Harvey, who I think is actually a professor at a college out in the Midwest. I think she's from Iowa. So she's, you know, in your area, and she really talks, again, very personally and very intelligently about how we as Christians can, and in the church, can interact with people around the issues of race. And then I think a wonderful story by a woman named Debbie Irving is Waking Up White. It's a story, a woman, when she was in her 40s, she went back to college to get a master's degree. And she was in this interracial program and had all sorts of interactions with people and critical incidents, you might say, that really woke her up to the reality of racism in her own life and how it had impacted her. And I think all of these books in different ways sort of help us understand how racism impacts our lives and how we can respond. And then I think there are now more and more resources out there that are written particularly for white folks on how can we respond. And I put one of my own books up there, White Allies in the Struggle for Racial Justice. This book it's 17 stories of 18 white people through American history who sought to work on behalf of racial justice in their time. And it really came out of interacting with my white students in my race and ethnic relations courses, who often would feel overwhelmed by the reality of racism and how it had impacted them. And I actually wrote these stories with the idea of providing role models for people about what does it mean to be an ally in the struggle for racial justice. And Wide Awake is written by a pastor who has sought to inform his congregation and work with his congregation around issues of race and how they can respond. And then a book that I found particularly helpful is Lifting the White Veil by Jeff Hitchcock. Jeff Hitchcock is white. He's married to an African-American woman, and they do workshops all over the country on how to live together as people of color and as white people, and they try to live it out in their own marriage. And so there are lots of resources like these out there on how we as white people can respond to issues of racism. And then I think it's also a good idea to try to seek out authors and leaders of color. There are some amazing people who have written from their own perspective. In the left hand, there's Michael Eric Dyson, who's a college professor and a pastor, very prolific writer. Mark Charles, who's a Native American Christian author who's recently written a book on the doctrine of discovery, which was a papal declaration back in the 14th century that basically shaped the way that Europeans interacted with the Native Americans that they encountered. Toni Morrison, who's a well-known novelist. Maya Angelou, also well-known, both deceased. James Baldwin, who was really ahead of his time in the 1960s, writing some very insightful things about racism that still are relevant today. And Soo-Chung Rah, who's a Korean professor who writes a lot from a Christian perspective about race and ethnicity and how that has shaped our understanding of the gospel. And so I think exposing ourselves to these people in their writings can also be a way of informing us. And these are all different things that we can do to kind of help ourselves become more educated. And I know someone last week mentioned a book that I had never heard of before, but I did look up and it looks like an excellent book, Power, Privilege, and Difference. So there are lots of other books out there. And I was wondering if anybody had anything that they had come across that they'd found particularly helpful that they would want to share with us on this general topic of racism. Any books that you've used or encountered that you found helpful?
Roots and
Someone from our group is saying Alex Haley's novels, Roots
and he's written another one that's called Queenie.
and Queenie.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Kind of really tells the story. Wonderful books.
I was thinking of James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Oh, yeah. That's a powerful book. For those of you who don't know, he kind of draws a comparison between the act of lynching and the cross, and in essence suggesting that had Jesus lived today and been a person of color, he would have been lynched. And what does that mean? What does that tell us about our society? What does that tell us about the church? And yeah, it's a powerful book. A lot of James Coates' books are very thoughtful. Very thoughtful.
You just want to say what it is? Okay. I think we have one other.
Okay.
Braiding Sweetgrass is a book about Native American stories of how the world works blended with science.
Oh, okay. What is that called? Say that again.
Braiding Sweetgrass.
Braiding Sweetgrass. Okay.
This,
You have a book, sir?
yeah, this is Ken Hostetler again. And I guess one book which really helped me to understand about the influence of what whites had. Anyway, the book is about a small southern town. It's called Class and something in a southern town. And it really described what happened, what went on between whites and blacks in that town. It's about, I think the date was the late 20s, like 1929. I guess to me, it showed how really helpless blacks were with the power structure of whites in that town. Like the women really had no protection of a white man coming into their house and doing what he wanted to do. And I guess that really said to me, you know, I'll never forget that. Plus, it really helped me.
Mhm.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I know. So,
Yeah, you make me think in that book, Slaves in My Family, one of the things he discovered is that his ancestors had done the very thing you described. They'd raped some of the slave women, and so he had cousins, so to speak, amongst the slaves from what his ancestors had done. Yeah, it's understanding that history is very uncomfortable, but it does help us understand. You know, history is never in the past. It's what makes us who we are in the present. And you know, the great saying, those who forget history, who fail to learn from history, are going to repeat it. And so often we want to just sort of say, well, that's in the past. We don't have to worry about that. That was then, this is now. But often the things that we struggle with today are a result of things that came to us through our ancestors and through our history. So very important. So thank you for sharing that. So all of these things.
There are a few more on the chat there.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry. Where's the chat? Oh, yeah. So, okay. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. Yeah, that's a powerful story. He basically wrote that book for his 14-year-old son, telling him what's the world you're coming in. An American Marriage by Tyan Jones, and Homegoing by Ya Gyasi. I've not read American Marriage, but Homegoing I have read, and that's an amazing story of what two families, and one that was captured and brought to the United States as slaves, and the other that stayed in Africa. The Warmth of Other Suns, yes, that's the story of the Great Migration in the 30s and 40s, when many African Americans decided to leave the South and come to the northern cities, thinking they were going to be welcomed with open arms, and found that racism was as alive and well in the North as it was in the South. Yeah, those are all great examples. Thank you. So all of this, this self-analysis and discovery helps us appreciate and helps us be informed when we talk about racism. That we do a personal history of our significant events. We realize and learn from our mistakes about intending to do one thing but impacting people another way, and how that may have caused some confusion. Learned about the nature of racism in our society and in our lives, and learn from others. And all of this, again, to help inform our race story. So that's the first thing I want to stress, is it's really important for us to educate ourselves and to reflect on those experiences in our lives that have shaped us and shaped our understanding. So the second thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is, how do we respond to white people in our lives who either may have done or said something overtly racist, or who are afraid when we bring up the topic of racism? I have found that in predominantly white spaces, that whites feel much freer to speak overtly about racism than when they're in more diverse groups. I lived in Jersey City, New Jersey, and in Boston, Massachusetts, both of which were very racially diverse areas. And then I moved to southern Minnesota, and it was really in southern Minnesota where I heard the most overt racist things people said to me, as if it was just common knowledge. And I found that I was really in this predominantly white space where there were, I think in the town I lived in, there was one black person and one Jewish person, and the rest was all, good old white folks. And yet I heard more overtly racist things in those spaces than in the other places I lived, where there was lots of diversity. One of the things that happens when we are in predominantly white environments is something that Robin DiAngelo calls white solidarity. And what she means by white solidarity is there's kind of a silence that we have, that we hear someone say something, we may not think it's really right, we might not like it, but it's sort of expected, well, we just won't say anything. That's just that person. He's just who he is. We're not going to make a big deal. And what that does is it reinforces that it's okay to say those things. And the first couple of times that I heard things, I was so taken aback in this small town. I was so taken aback, I didn't know what to say. So I had to sort of get myself ready to say, "Ooh, wait a minute, what's going on here?" I earlier spoke about, last time spoke about backstage racism and aversive racism, which are, backstage racism is basically when whites get together and they talk and they share things. And aversive racism is when we just avoid the topic altogether. And as I said, sometimes just even bringing up the topic of race, say talking about something that happened in the news that had a racial element to it, people will just get very uncomfortable. And so how do we respond to these situations? We have an opportunity, I think, as white people who are concerned about these things, to address racism with other white folks in a way that no one else can. But it does require breaking that sort of solidarity of silence about the issue. We can't always wait for experts to come in or people of color to come to us and talk to us about race. We white people, I really believe, need to break this silence, this taboo in our communities, and talk about this important topic. Because so often things are said and things are done and we kind of bite our tongues and look the other way and don't say anything. And I don't think that's productive for the people who are saying those things, and it's certainly not productive if we want to really address racism in our society. So what do we do when someone makes a racist comment? I think our goal, and this is a goal, we don't always achieve it, but our goal is to delegitimize the comment or the action, but not the person. Why do I say that? There's not been enough study about what leads to racism, that it's very often these kind of comments are evidence of fear or insecurity or hurt or low self-esteem, and that people do and say certain things as a way of trying to legitimize themselves and build themselves up at the expense of others. But at the root, at what's behind it, is something that really makes them feel less than. When we hear a lot of these kind of comments, people are trying to build themselves up and really hiding something that makes them feel insecure. And so I think it's really important to try and get behind what's behind the comment or the action. What is it that prompts this? And by doing that, we start a process of transformation that may not happen overnight, but at least plants a seed in a person's mind that, oh, maybe there's a different way to look at it. We want to try and start that process of transformation without increasing their defensiveness. And that's hard, because often if you raise a question to people, their immediate response is to withdraw and get very defensive. And if someone gets defensive at something, we say that doesn't mean we have failed. It's just recognizing just how powerful racism is in our lives and how quickly people will respond. So I want to share some suggestions about how do we respond. And I think the first thing is to think through how you will respond to people. If you've been in situations where people have done or said things and maybe you didn't know what to say. Well, this is your opportunity to think about it and think, okay, what will I do next time? Not all of us are great at thinking on our feet. So it always helps to kind of think through things a little bit. And if things come up, how will we deal with them? When appropriate, it may be helpful to use a little humor. Tim Wise, whose book I mentioned before, White Like Me, tells a story one time when he went to a university out in the West. I think it was in Wyoming or Montana, one of those states he was at. He was speaking, and he'd done his speech, and then the group that had sponsored him said, well, you want to come out? We'll go out to dinner. So he went out to dinner with these folks, and one of their friends who had not been at the presentation showed up. And this guy started talking, and he started telling a racist joke. And of course, everybody else in the group is like, oh my God, he's telling this racist joke with this guy who's just talked to us for an hour about how we need to deal with racism. And they're all very uneasy. And when Tim tells the story, he said, well, he said, my mother's black. And of course, the guy was very embarrassed, and he apologized to Tim and said, geez, if I'd known your mother was black, I wouldn't have said this. And then Tim said, well, actually, my mother isn't black, but why does it matter? Why can you tell this joke when you don't think anyone of color is in the room, but it's not okay when someone is? And he kind of used humor and kind of playing with the guy a little bit to make him aware that you don't always know who you're with, and that you really need to pay attention to your attitudes. I think one of the things that I've tried to do when people get very uptight about issues of racism or even start making racist statements, I will ask them a question. I said, can you tell me a story as to why you talk like that, or why you said that? What is it that in your background that led you to think that way and to act that way? And I try to do it in a curious kind of way. I'm not trying to use that as a way to get at a person, but really trying to explore with them, what is the story behind their racist actions or their racist comments? And what I found when I asked that question, it really sort of stops people in their tracks, because oftentimes people do and say things without much reflection. And even if they tell their story, as they tell their story, I ask questions just trying to help elucidate it. And what I've found is sort of like, almost like in the counseling session, where a good counselor doesn't really talk much, but asks questions and gets their client to talk. And it's in the talking that people begin to realize things about themselves. And so sometimes we can ask people to say, well, what made you say that? Why did you say that? What was behind that? And get them to tell the story. I think it's really important to try and help people learn from their experience. We learn from our experience and can learn from their experience. But I think the most important thing is we don't want to remain silent. This is an opportunity for us to bring things into the conversation. It's not a topic that's going to come up on its own accord in most cases. It's something that we need to bring up and get people to think about, and allow people to the grace to realize that we're all in process. And I think that's where approaching them humbly, approaching them with curiosity, rather than saying, oh, you're all wrong, is really important, because we don't want to delegitimize the person. They are still a human being made in the image of God, regardless of how they act. And so getting people to think about why they do what they do, I think, is really important as we try to interact with people. Now, sometimes, as brother shared last time, sometimes someone's just out of line and you just have to stand up and say like he did, we don't tolerate that kind of actions here. And sometimes that's the best you can do. but with people you know, people you have relationships with, it really, you can use the power of your relationship to really engage them in conversation about why they say and do what they do. Are there any other ideas or things that any of you maybe have thought about as you think about interacting with others who may have done or said things that seem overtly racist? Any experiences anyone has that you might be able to share with us?
I would just mention as a tax preparer, I talk to lots of different people throughout tax season, and occasionally we'll just be talking about all kinds of different things, and all of a sudden there will be this comment that I'm just horrified that I just heard from this person's mouth, and I don't know quite, you know, some kind of comment about, usually it's in reference to Native Americans or Hispanics, and I'm, you know, kind of just caught off guard and don't know quite what to say. Although I do know one time they made a comment about Hispanics, and so I said, well, you know, I have a number of Hispanic tax clients, and, you know, I found them to be, I think there was some kind of comment about them being lazy, or I don't remember exactly, you know, to be hardworking and, you know, good people, and, you know, didn't dwell on it a lot, but just kind of said, you know, my experience is different than what you're expressing here, and just kind of left it at that. And I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but at least it was, you know, it's something, because usually I'm just caught off guard and I don't know what to say.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, obviously I don't know the person who might say this, but, and you are kind of working for them, so that it's a different kind of relationship. But, you know, asking, well, what leads you to say that? You know, I don't see it that way. What leads you to say that? And get him to stand on, you know, what he's saying. Why is he saying it? I think, yeah, and, you know, thinking through that. But that's, yeah. But I think sharing your own experience is always a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Because I think a lot of times they don't have really a basis for doing it. It's just what they've heard or what they hear, you know, other people say, and they just go with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, but even the way you've interrupted it that way, you've let them know that, okay, this guy actually thinks in a different way about it. So, you know, it's not validating his bias in that place.
Right.
Any other experiences or ideas about how to interact around issues of race with other people? Okay, well, let's, oh, someone coming up. Okay, let's go back.
On the subject of educating ourselves, and you mentioned all these wonderful books, but a lot of people do not read, and their education comes from sound bites and newspaper headlines and that sort of thing. One suggestion I would have, if people are not readers, is films.
Mm-hmm.
I think can be a very powerful, you know, with an interracial theme or a social justice theme, or those kinds of films, documentaries, and even novels. I think can be a way of sort of maybe a more painless way of educating ourselves for people that do not have the time or the inclination to read whole books.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And there are, I think, increasingly there are some really excellent films that are coming out. One of the challenges with the media, whether it's TV or films, is some films are really good at educating. Other films just reinforce the negative stereotypes. And you know, really, we really need to become critical thinkers about what we're being shown on the TV, because sometimes the things they share are just reinforcing all those negative things. I will say a great movie that's out now, I don't know if it's gotten out your way or not, but it came out about a month ago, called Just Mercy. Excellent book about a lawyer in Alabama who worked with death row inmates, and it tells the story of one particular inmate who was unjustly imprisoned and how this lawyer, Brian Stevenson, got him out. Really powerful film. But there's lots of others. There's a new film that's coming out on Harriet Tubman called Harriet that came out last fall. And I'm sure in the next few months, a lot of those will be available on like Netflix and those kind of things. Wanted to say a few words about talking about racism in the church, because I think this is one place where we have a great opportunity to talk to folks in a community that is at least implicitly, if not explicitly, called to be concerned about these kind of issues. Now, at the same time, we have to acknowledge that our history has not always been something we can be all that proud of. I mean, we talked, I think last time, someone mentioned, for instance, that for much of our history, there was biblical support for the institution of slavery through talking about the Moses' son Ham and his descendants being African and being second class. And then certainly those passages in Paul, which seem to justify slavery. And we, you know, and the church has often been segregated. We've, you know, sometimes it was deliberately so, other times it just happens that way. We've not always been open to people of other races. And the idea of multiracial, multi-church is still more of an exception than a rule. And we've not, you know, we've not always spoken out against issues of racism that occur in our area like we should. You may have heard of Martin Luther King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail. He was imprisoned in Birmingham in 1963 because he was trying to desegregate the stores in that city. And a bunch of ministers, clergy, Jewish and Christian ministers, wrote him to say, slow down. And he wrote that letter from a Birmingham jail in response to that letter from those clergymen. And he basically said, you know, we've waited and things have not changed. And he said, often the people who are our greatest barrier are those who remain silent, who tell us to slow down. So the church has not always been good, but we can make a difference. And I think one of the places that the church has an advantage over other institutions is we do have our Christian faith as a common bond. And so it's through that often we can reach out to churches that may be primarily populated by groups that are of other ethnic or racial groups and try to learn from them and learn with them. One of the things that I think was very helpful to me as a young person living in Minneapolis is that in the 1960s, my pastor always had pulpit exchanges with an African-American church in the city of Minneapolis. And he spoke at their church and their pastor came and spoke at ours. And, you know, I don't remember any of the sermons, but I remember just thinking, wow, that's something that we as the church should do. And one of the things that I think we can do is we can find and create opportunities for personal action where we can actually sit down across the table and eat a meal at a church supper with people of different races. Many churches have gotten involved in helping to sponsor refugees and immigrant groups as they come into our community. And that too has, I think, a double advantage. One is it gives us, again, an opportunity to interact with people who are racially and ethnically different than us. but also it sends a message to the wider community that this is what the church is about. And so I think the church provides us an opportunity to have that personal interaction around our Christian faith. And I have found that probably the most effective way to begin to break down racial barriers is to sit down and have a conversation and share a meal with someone. It's pretty easy to start throwing all sorts of things out to someone you don't really know, but when you sit across them and you hear their story and they hear yours, something begins to change inside each of us. I do also think that racism is a topic that we need to talk about from the pulpit. I was a Baptist pastor for 16 years, and in 2 of the churches that I worked in, they were all white, predominantly white churches. One in that small town in Minnesota, and the other one in the suburbs here of Philadelphia. And I always made the occasion of Martin Luther King's birthday, that holiday in January, as an occasion to talk about racism. And I had people who would walk out of the service. I actually had an organist in my last church who always took that Sunday off, which was fine, because then I could pull out my guitar and we could sing "We Shall Overcome." But it is a tough topic sometimes to talk from the pulpit, but it's something we need to. It's one of those issues that is hurting us as a church. It's hurting us as a nation, and we need to address. And so, I would encourage us to use our Sunday school classes, our small groups, our opportunities to have fellowship with other churches as a way of beginning to model what we say we believe. And it won't be easy. And we may get some pushback. We may have some people who say, well, maybe this is not what I want to do. But I think that's what the gospel is all about. I mean, Jesus had that same problem. And if I've got the same problem as Jesus, I think I'm okay. So those are just a few thoughts on the church. Oops.
There was one other chat there.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I guess this is going back when we were talking about interacting.
Right.
I have found that the word "why" can be problematic. Rather, tell me more. I wonder what that comes from. Yeah, I think you're right. The word "why" kind of sends people to the corners. But yeah, tell me more. Tell me more. Yeah, try to express curiosity. Great. So I guess when we sit down and we talk about how do we interact, we want to do what we can in our spheres of influence to counter the pervasiveness of racism. And the gentleman who's pictured here is a man by the name of Derek Bell. Derek Bell, he recently passed away, but he was best known for developing something called critical race theory. And one of the tenets of critical race theory is that racism is so woven into American history and life that we should always ask the question, is racism an issue here? And if so, how? And so it is to think about, maybe something that a political candidate says, or maybe a decision that was made that was made in the community, or an action in the community, to always sort of ask the question, is there something about racism at work here? And that doesn't mean it always is, but it's a question that's worth acting, because what it does is it develops our awareness and sensitivity to the pervasiveness of racism in our lives. And looking at, asking the question, how might racism be influencing our churches? How am I talking to my children and my grandchildren and my friends and my family about these issues? And what message am I leaving? And what can I do to educate myself and educate others and become an agent of change and reconciliation. And I think that's the ultimate challenge for us as people of faith, is to be continually growing ourselves, and where we have opportunity to act and speak in ways that invite people to reflect on their own attitudes and their own experiences, and if possible, bring about change. As I said, later this year, I hope to publish a book, and I talk much more about things we've talked about tonight in that book. But beyond that, I encourage you to make this part of your daily life. Racism is dividing our country. It's tearing us apart. And yet, as I said, we are the most racially and culturally diverse nation in the world. And so it's not something we can avoid. It's not something we can get away with, away from. And it's certainly something that we as people of faith, followers of Jesus, should make part of our everyday life and everyday call to follow the one that we call Lord. And with that, thank you for listening. And I guess it's time for any kind of questions or comments that anybody would like to make. Any final questions or thoughts?
I heard a radio show today where a queer Black woman said, first we have to define intersectionality. Anytime we talk about a social identity or a system of power in isolation with other social identities or other systems of power, we're kind of losing the whole scope of it. So that's like your matrix you showed in the first time, that I have a privilege and I also have a disability, if you will, something that offsets that, and many people see a whole realm of how they would describe themselves, not just racist. So your last statement where you said, is racism part of this? I would say, is privilege part of this incident?
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, your point about intersectionality is well taken. And I think, as I said last time, I think we do have to recognize that there are many different ways that we may be in the dominant or subordinate side of that equation, whether it's gender or sexual orientation or age or ability, education. But I do think, and people are kind of free to disagree with, but I do think race is still the most powerful one of those dichotomies, that not to ignore the others, they certainly have a place, but I think it, and I focus just on race here, because I think it's so pervasive in everything that goes on in our nation and in our lives. Any other thoughts or comments? Chris, I think we're kind of at our time anyway here. You have any final thoughts? You want to close us out?
Sure. Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank you, Drick, for being willing to take the time and effort and preparation to be with us on these 3 Tuesdays. It's we've really benefited from your insights and from your thinking about this through many decades, and your life experiences as well. So thank you so much for doing this for us. I would just mention the first 2 sessions are already on the website, and this one will be as well in a few days. And like Drick mentioned, this now becomes a resource for us to be able to use in our churches, in our Sunday school classes or Bible studies, as a way of bringing up or working through issues of race. We can use this webinar or portions of it, and so we want to keep that in mind too as going forward. So I think if we've kind of closed our discussion here, and we thank you for the challenges you've laid before us, Drick, and the insights to help us work on those challenges. And so we will close it here and wish everyone a good evening.
Yeah, thank you all for taking the time. This really means a lot to me. That folks I've only met virtually, we've become partners in this struggle. So thank you all, and God bless you all.